The air inside the massive concert hall felt heavy, like it was filled with water instead of oxygen. It was the kind of place that made you feel small just by looking at it. The ceilings were so high they seemed to touch the clouds, decorated with enough gold leaf to make a king jealous. Huge crystal chandeliers hung down like frozen waterfalls, casting a bright white light over everything. The floor was polished marble, so shiny you could see your reflection staring back at you. This was the Versailles Grand Hall, the most famous and expensive music building in the entire world. Every year, they held a competition here that musicians talked about for months. Only the best players were allowed to step foot on this stage. The prize money was enough to change a life forever. But the trophy was made of solid crystal and worth more than most houses. Backstage. In the cramped and dark wings, the mood was very different. It was cold and smelled of old dust and nervous sweat. The walls were painted a flat, ugly gray, a sharp contrast to the shining gold out front. This is where a young woman named Kyra stood, waiting for her name to be called. She was 19 years old, but at this moment she felt like a scared child. She was dressed in a simple, long black dress. It was not made of silk or velvet like the other girls were wearing. It was a basic piece of clothing she had found at a second-hand store. It fit her well enough, but she felt out of place among the sequins and diamonds that flashed around her. She kept her head down, staring at her worn-out shoes, trying to calm the wild beating of her heart. Around her, the other musicians were warming up. They looked expensive. They held violins and cellos that cost more than cars, polished to a mirror shine. They talked about their private tutors and their summer trips to Vienna. Kyra stayed silent. She reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around a small, worn ribbon. It was soft from age, the edges fraying. It was a deep red color, the only thing she had left from her grandmother. Her grandmother had been the one to put a piano in their tiny living room, an old instrument that was always slightly out of tune. She had been the one to sit beside Kyra for hours, listening to her practice, the same scales over and over again. That grandmother was gone now, passed away just a year ago. The silence in the house since then had been louder than any city noise. Kyra played today not just for the prize, but because she needed to fill that silence again. Next, a voice crackled over the speaker. It was a harsh electronic sound that made Kyra jump. "Kyra, you are on?" The other girls stopped talking. Some of them looked at her with pity. Others looked at her with indifference. She took a deep breath, pulling the air in slowly, trying to fill her lungs with courage. She patted the ribbon in her pocket one last time, feeling the rough texture against her fingertips. It was her anchor. It reminded her of why she was here. She wasn't here to impress the rich people in the audience. She was here to play something real. She walked out of the darkness of the wings and into the blinding light of the stage. The transition was shocking. The air out here was different, cooler and stiller. The moment she stepped onto the marble floor, the noise from the audience vanished. It wasn't that they stopped talking on purpose. It was the power of the room. 500 people were staring at her, and 500 pairs of eyes went quiet. In the center of the stage sat the monster. It was a Steinway grand piano, black as midnight and massive. It looked like it weighed as much as a truck. The lid was propped open, reflecting the stage lights. It was a beautiful machine, but it was terrifying. This piano was worth more money than Kyra's family had seen in 3 generations. She felt a wave of panic wash over her. Her hands felt cold and clammy. Asterisk, what if I mess up? She thought. Asterisk, what if I touch it and it breaks? She walked toward the bench, her legs feeling heavy like she was walking through deep mud. She sat down. The bench was leather, creaking slightly under her weight. It squeaked, a tiny, embarrassing sound that echoed through the giant hall. She adjusted the height, trying to find the right position. She wiped her sweaty palms on the fabric of her black dress. The silence stretched out. It felt thick and heavy, pressing against her ears. She looked up at the judges' table. It was a long piece of mahogany wood placed on a raised platform, looking down on the stage like a throne. Behind it sat 5 people. These were the most important music critics in the world. They were dressed in expensive suits and formal gowns. They looked serious. They looked tired. The man in the middle was the oldest. He had silver hair, and a face that looked like it was carved from stone. He was not looking at Kyra. His eyes were closed, his head resting in his hand. He looked like he was trying to take a nap. The woman next to him was twisting a diamond ring around her finger. Her eyes glazed over, staring at a spot on the wall. To her left, a man with glasses was checking his watch, tapping his foot impatiently. They had been sitting there for 6 hours. They had listened to hundreds of players. They had heard perfect technique and fast fingers all day. They were bored. They were not interested in a girl in a cheap dress sitting at a piano that cost too much. Kyra felt a pang of fear in her chest. They already hated her. She could feel it. They wanted her to hurry up and play so they could go to dinner. They wanted her to be boring so they could reject her quickly. The air in the hall felt oppressive. It wasn't just a room. It was a judge, jury, and executioner all in one. She looked down at the keys. They were white and black, waiting for her. They were innocent. They didn't care about her dress or her nervousness. They only made a sound when she touched them. She thought about her grandmother again. She thought about the way the old woman used to smile when Kyra played. The way the music seemed to make the broken world outside their window disappear for a little while. "Please," she whispered the words silently in her head. "Just let me play." The 10 seconds of silence felt like 10 hours. The stillness of the room was suffocating. The audience shifted in their seats. A cough echoed from the back row. The bored judge in the middle let out a long, slow sigh that Kyra could hear from the stage. The pressure was immense. It felt like the entire world was waiting for her to fail. The grandeur of the hall, the history of the competition, the exhaustion of the judges, it all weighed down on her small shoulders. But then, something inside her shifted. She stopped looking at the judges. She stopped thinking about the money and the fancy clothes. She focused on the feeling of the ribbon in her pocket and the memory of the sound of her grandmother's voice. She let out a long breath, letting the tension flow out of her shoulders, down her arms, and into her fingertips. She was here. She had fought too hard to get to this spot to let them scare her away. She placed her hands on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth under her touch. She was ready. The boredom of the room was about to break, but nobody knew it yet. The silence hovered for one last heartbeat, holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. The silence in the hall did not feel peaceful. It felt heavy and sour, like old milk. It was the kind of silence that happens when a large group of people has stopped caring. From her spot on the bench, Kyra could feel the mood of the room shifting. It wasn't just quiet. It was impatient. The air seemed to vibrate with the unspoken thoughts of the audience and the judges. They were tired. They were hungry. They wanted to go home. Kyra sat frozen, her hands hovering just above the keys. She wasn't trying to be dramatic by waiting. She just needed a moment to find her courage. She needed to remember who she was playing for. But to the people watching, this pause looked like hesitation. It looked like fear. In a world where everyone rushed to be the best and the fastest, stopping for even 10 seconds felt like a mistake. The stage lights were incredibly bright. They were hot, beating down on her face like a summer sun. Kyra could feel tiny beads of sweat forming on her forehead. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep the sting of sweat out of her eyes. Under the harsh glare, she felt exposed. She felt like a bug under a microscope. If she made a mistake, everyone would see it. If she trembled, everyone would judge her. The black dress felt like it was sticking to her back, making her uncomfortable and self-conscious. On the raised platform, the judges were losing their patience. The man in the middle, the one with the silver hair who looked like a statue, finally lifted his head slightly. He didn't open his eyes. He just let out a long, bored breath that made his shoulders rise and fall. He had heard thousands of pianists in his life. He knew the signs of a student who wasn't ready. He saw a girl in a cheap dress who was stalling. He had already made up his mind about her before she played a single note. He assumed she would be average, boring, or just plain bad. He picked up a pen and tapped it rhythmically against the wooden table. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was small, but to Kyra, it echoed like a hammer. Next to him, the woman with the diamond ring stopped looking at the wall. She turned her cold gaze directly onto Kyra. It wasn't a look of encouragement. It was a look of annoyance. She shifted her weight in her expensive chair, the leather creaking softly. She crossed her arms, signaling that she was closing herself off. She was mentally checking out. In her mind, this audition was already a waste of time. She was thinking about the dinner reservation she had at a fancy restaurant across the river. She was wondering if the traffic would be bad on the way home. The boredom was contagious. It spread through the front rows like a cold wind. People in the audience, the ones who had paid hundreds of dollars for tickets, started to shuffle their feet. A man in the third row cleared his throat loudly. The sound was harsh and rude. A few people whispered to each other. Kyra could see their heads turning. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she knew they weren't whispering about her talent. They were whispering about the delay. They were wondering why this girl was just sitting there. She going to play? Someone whispered loudly from the back of the hall. The words hit Kyra like a slap. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second. She felt a hot flush of embarrassment rise up her neck and into her cheeks. She knew she should just start. She should just play the first note and get it over with. But her fingers felt stiff. They felt like frozen sausages. She was terrified that if she moved them, they would slip. The piano in front of her was so big, so majestic, it looked like it belonged to a palace, not to a girl like her. She felt like an imposter. She felt like she had snuck into a party she wasn't invited to. She looked down at the keys again. They were white and black, arranged in a perfect pattern. They were just pieces of plastic and wood, but right now, they looked like a mountain she had to climb. She thought about the other contestants. They had played with confidence. They had sat down and immediately crashed their hands into the keys, showing off their speed and their strength. They played to impress. They played to show the judges how hard they had practiced. But Kyra didn't have that kind of arrogance. She didn't want to show off. She wanted to share something. She wanted to share the pain and the love that was stuck inside her heart. The judge with the glasses stopped tapping his pen. He leaned forward slightly, squinting at her. He was trying to figure out what was wrong. Was she having technical difficulties? Was she scared? Or was she just unprepared? He saw a young girl who looked overwhelmed by the grandeur of the hall. He saw the worn-out dress. He saw the nervous posture. He didn't see a musician. He saw a mess. A small, cynical smile curled the corner of his mouth. He was waiting for the train wreck. He was waiting for her to panic and run off the stage. 10 seconds. That was all it took. 10 seconds of sitting in the spotlight, sweating and breathing, while the most important people in the music world stared at her with annoyance. It felt like an eternity. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. The pressure was immense. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for her to fail. The grandeur of the room, which should have inspired her, now felt like a cage. It was a golden, expensive cage that was trapping her. The silence was no longer just silence. It was a wall between her and the audience. Kyra's heart hammered against her ribs. Thump, thump, thump. It was so loud she was sure the microphones could pick it up. She felt the familiar sensation of tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She willed them away. She couldn't cry now. Not here, not in front of them. If she cried, they would win. Their boredom would defeat her. She thought about the ribbon in her pocket again. She imagined the texture of it, rough and woven. She imagined the smell of her grandmother's house, the scent of old wood and lavender soap. She remembered the way her grandmother used to tap her on the shoulder when she made a mistake. Not to scold her, but to encourage her to keep going. Music is feelings, her grandmother used to say. Asterisk, if you feel it, they will feel it. Asterisk, but right now, there were no feelings in the room, only boredom. The judges were closed off. The audience was restless. The connection was broken. It was up to her to fix it, but she felt so small. She felt like a single drop of water trying to move an ocean. The doubt swirled in her head. You don't belong here, the voice in her head whispered. Asterisk, look at them. They are waiting for you to leave. Asterisk, the man with the silver hair sighed again, louder this time. He actually checked his watch, lifting his wrist slowly and deliberately. He looked at the time. then let his wrist drop back onto the table with a thud. It was the ultimate insult. It was a sign that said, "You are not worth my time." The critic on the end picked up his clipboard. He held a pen over a sheet of paper. Kyra knew he was ready to write a score. He was ready to give her a 0. He was ready to cross her name off the list before she even played a chord. He was looking at his watch, too. He was counting the seconds. He was thinking about the next contestant. Someone who would come out in a fancy dress and play loud, fast, and impressive music. The tension in the room was stifling. It felt like a thick fog that Kyra had to walk through. Every second that passed made the fog heavier. She knew she had to move. She knew she had to break the silence. If she waited one more second, they would probably start booing. They might turn off the lights. They might tell her to get down. So she took a deep breath. She filled her lungs until they hurt. She pushed away the image of the bored judges. She pushed away the fear of the expensive hall. She closed her eyes and focused entirely on the feeling in her hands. She wasn't going to play to impress them anymore. She wasn't going to play to show off. She was going to play for the ribbon in her pocket. She was going to play for the silence in her own house. The boredom in the room was at its peak. The atmosphere was dull and gray. Everyone was checked out. Everyone was waiting for the end. But Kyra was finally waking up. The fear was still there, gnawing at her stomach, but underneath the fear, there was something else. There was a spark. It was a tiny, glowing ember of determination. She was going to play, and she was going to play exactly how she needed to play. She didn't care if they were bored. She didn't care if they checked their watches. She was going to make them listen. Her hands stopped hovering. They lowered slowly, deliberately, towards the keys. The audience didn't notice. The judges didn't notice. They were too busy looking at their watches, too busy thinking about dinner. But the moment was about to change. The girl in the black dress was about to disappear, and the music was about to appear. Then Kyra's hands finally moved. They did not slam down onto the keys like a storm, nor did they dance lightly like a butterfly. They moved with a slow, deliberate weight, as if she were lifting a heavy stone and placing it carefully into the earth. Her left hand found the lowest notes on the piano. She pressed down. A deep, resonant sound filled the hall. It wasn't just a note. It was a vibration. You could feel it in the floorboards under your feet. You could feel it in the seat of your chair. It was a sound so low and heavy that it seemed to rattle the ribs of everyone listening. It was the sound of a large bell ringing in a distant valley, or the growl of the earth before it shakes. It hung in the air, dark and rich, demanding attention. The judge with the silver hair, who had been rubbing his temples to soothe a headache, froze. His hands stopped moving. The vibration from that single note seemed to travel through the mahogany table and into his fingertips. It was a clean sound, but it was also sad. It was the kind of sound that made you want to hold your breath. The critic had been poised to write a harsh rejection, lifted his pen just an inch off the paper. He paused. He had heard thousands of opening notes in his career. Most were technical, sharp, and meaningless. But this note had a texture to it. It sounded like a human voice groaning in grief. He frowned slightly, confused by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The boredom in the room didn't vanish instantly, but it cracked. The gray cloud of impatience was pierced by a sudden shaft of dark blue light. Kyra did not rush to the next note. She let the deep sound fade away into silence until it was almost gone. Then her right hand entered. It played a melody that was simple, not fast or flashy. It climbed up the scale slowly, step by step. It was a lullaby, but a broken one. It wavered just a little, not because she couldn't control the pitch, because she was playing with a rubato, a stolen time. She was stretching the notes like taffy, pulling the emotion out of them. She closed her eyes again, shutting out the harsh spotlights. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she wasn't in the Versailles Grand Hall anymore. She was back in her small living room. The air smelled like old paper and the mothballs her grandmother used in the closet. She saw the rain streaking down the window pane of her childhood home, distorting the view of the street outside. She remembered the sound of the radiator hissing in the corner. A constant companion during the long winter nights, her fingers began to walk faster now. The music grew from a single, sad thread into a complex weave of sound. The left hand kept the deep, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, while the right hand began to cry. The notes became closer together, tighter, more urgent. The sound was no longer just sad. It was desperate. It was the feeling of wanting to say something important but not having the words. The audience, who had been shifting in their seats and checking their phones, slowly began to quiet down. It wasn't a forced silence. It was a magnetic pull. The music was weaving a spell. A teenager in the back row who had been texting his friends lowered his phone. He looked up at the stage. He didn't know anything about classical music. He didn't know a concerto from a sonata. But he knew what sadness sounded like. He knew what it sounded like to miss someone. And he was hearing that now. The judge on the far left, a woman known for her icy demeanor and hatred of mistakes, stopped checking her watch. She turned her head fully toward the stage. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the girl in the black dress. She was looking for the trick. She was looking for the moment where Kyra would mess up, where the technique would fail. But she didn't see any fear in the girl's hands anymore. She saw strength. She saw fingers that were striking the keys with precision, but also with a tenderness that was rare. The music began to swell. It was like a tide coming in. The waves were getting higher. Kyra's body started to move with the music. She wasn't stiff anymore. She swayed slightly from side to side, like a tree in the wind. The expensive dress she wore flowed with her movement. She looked like she was disappearing into the instrument. The boundaries between the girl, the piano, the sound were melting away. She brought her hands down together for a loud, crashing chord that echoed through the high ceilings. It wasn't a violent noise. It was a release. It was the sound of a door being kicked open. The chandeliers overhead seemed to flicker in response to the energy radiating from the stage. The sound washed over the judges, hitting them in the chest. The lead judge, the man with the silver hair, finally opened his eyes. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't look at the other judges. He looked straight at Kyra. For the first time in 6 hours, he looked awake. The boredom was gone, replaced by a look of intense curiosity. He realized that this wasn't just a student playing notes on a page. This was a storyteller, and the story she was telling was a painful one. Kyra remembered the day she had to sell the old family piano. She remembered the movers carrying it out of the apartment, leaving a rectangular clean spot on the dusty carpet where it used to sit. She remembered how empty the house had felt after that. The silence had been deafening. She poured that emptiness into the music now. She played the spaces between the notes just as much as the notes themselves. The silence became part of the song. The tempo picked up. The melody twisted and turned, going from major key happy and bright to minor key dark and sorrowful in the blink of an eye. It was unpredictable, just like grief. One moment you are fine, the next you are drowning. Her fingers flew across the ivory keys, executing complicated runs that required years of practice. But to the audience, it didn't look like practice. It looked like instinct. The critic with the pen found himself leaning forward. His mouth opened slightly. He was a professional. He knew the difficulty of the piece she was playing. It was technically demanding. But the way she was playing it, the way she was bending the tempo, the way she was emphasizing certain notes to make them sing, that was not something you could teach in a school. That was a gift. Or perhaps it was a curse that had been turned into art. The energy in the hall had completely changed. The room felt electric now. The air seemed to hum with the sound. The earlier tension of impatience had been replaced by a tension of anticipation. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see where she would take them next. It was no longer about the money or the trophy. It was no longer about the expensive clothes or the grand setting. All of that surface stuff had fallen away. There was only a girl on a bench, pouring her heart out through 88 black and white keys. The sound grew richer, fuller. Kyra was using the pedals now, layering the sounds on top of each other, creating a thick wall of harmony that surrounded the audience like a warm fog. It was beautiful, but it was terrifying. It was the sound of a heart breaking open. The man with the silver hair reached up and adjusted his glasses. He realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, his eyes never leaving the stage. The girl in the second-hand dress was doing the impossible. She was making a cold, golden hall feel like a warm, human home. She was connecting with them. She was bypassing their brains and speaking directly to their souls. The boredom was dead, buried under the weight of a truly profound sound. And the most incredible part was, she was just getting started. The real storm was still gathering in her fingertips, waiting to be unleashed. Then, the explosion happened. It wasn't a loud crash like a bomb going off or a drum being smashed. It was a release of energy that had been coiled up tight for so long that it finally snapped. Kyra's hands, which had been moving with a sad, flowing gentleness, suddenly transformed. They became a blur of motion. She launched into the cadenza, the part of the music where the orchestra would usually stop and the pianist is left, alone to show their true soul. This was not polite music anymore. This was raw. It was urgent. The sound that came out of the piano was like a torrential rain hitting a tin roof, but faster. Much faster. Her fingers raced up and down the keyboard, striking the notes with a ferocity that was frightening to watch. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was attacking them. She was pounding out the anger she felt at the universe for taking her grandmother away. She was pounding out the frustration of years of silence, of living in a world where she felt invisible. Every chord was a shout. Every trill was a sob that refused to be silent. The heavy vibration that had filled the hall, before suddenly turned into a physical force. The sound waves hit the front row like a gust of wind. The sheer volume of it was shocking. This wasn't the quiet, respectful background music you hear in a hotel lobby. This was a screaming declaration of existence. The judge with the silver hair, the one who had been ready to go home, flinched visibly. His eyes widened behind his glasses. He sat up straighter in his chair, his back no longer touching the wood. He stared at the stage, his mouth opening just a fraction. He had expected a mistake. He had expected her to lose control of the rhythm because of the speed. But she didn't miss a single note. Her accuracy was terrifying. She was running at full speed on a tightrope. She wasn't even looking down. To the side, the critic who had dropped his pen earlier now looked as if he might fall out of his chair. He wasn't bored anymore. He was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The music was demanding his attention, grabbing him by the collar and shaking him. He could see the sweat flying from Kyra's forehead as she shook her head with the rhythm. She was lost in it. She was possessed by it. Kyra wasn't thinking about technique now. She wasn't thinking about the expensive Steinway piano beneath her fingers. In her mind, she was back in that dusty old apartment. But it wasn't a sad memory anymore. It was a memory of power. She remembered the way her grandmother used to laugh deep in her belly when something was truly funny. She remembered the strength of the woman who had worked 2 jobs to put food on the table. Kyra was playing that strength. She was proving that even though she was small and dressed in cheap clothes, her spirit was a giant. The melody twisted and turned, becoming chaotic. It sounded like a storm tearing through a quiet forest. The high notes were sharp and piercing, like lightning bolts. The low notes were rumbling thunder. The music was angry, yes, but there was also a towering, massive beauty to it. It was the sound of a human being refusing to be crushed. The audience sat in stunned silence. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. No one looked at their phones. They were paralyzed. A young man in the 10th row had his hands over his mouth, his eyes wide. He felt like he was witnessing something dangerous, something wild. It was thrilling. Kyra's body swayed violently. She was no longer the stiff, scared girl who had walked out onto the stage 10 minutes ago. Her black dress swirled around her legs. Her hair was coming loose from the tight bun, falling over her face, but she didn't care. She didn't stop to push it back. She used that energy, leaning into the piano, almost hugging the instrument as she played. She was drawing every ounce of sound the piano was willing to give. The sound grew louder and louder, filling the entire massive volume of the Versailles Grand Hall. It bounced off the gold leaf on the ceiling. It rattled the windows. It felt like the roof might lift off. The air in the room seemed to heat up. The emotional temperature had risen from freezing cold to boiling hot in a matter of seconds. The judges, usually so composed and unmovable, were exchanging glances with each other. They were confused, amazed, and frightened all at the same time. They knew music theory. They knew the history of the composers. But this went beyond theory. This was primal. This was a girl pouring her lifeblood into the keys. The lead judge felt a strange tightness in his chest. He realized with a start that he was holding back tears. He hadn't cried at a performance in 30 years. But the sheer force of her emotion was breaking through his armor. Kyra hit a series of octaves, jumping her left hand down the keyboard while her right hand spun a web of intricate notes above it. The sound was like a series of explosions, rhythmic and powerful. Boom, boom, boom. Boom-ba-doom. It was the heartbeat of the song. It's racing out of control. She thought about the day the silence had won. She thought about standing in the empty room after her grandmother passed. That silence had been her enemy, and now she was destroying it. She was filling every corner of the world with noise, with life, with passion. The silence had nowhere left to hide. It was being chased away by the thunder coming from her hands. Her arms ached. Her fingers were starting to feel like they were on fire, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She felt like she was running down a steep hill, and she couldn't slow down, and she didn't want to. She was playing for every person who had ever been ignored. She was playing for every poor kid who had ever looked through a window at something they couldn't have. She was taking this expensive fancy stage and claiming it for herself. The music reached a fever pitch. It was so loud that it was almost uncomfortable, but it was a beautiful discomfort. It was the feeling of a sunburn on a hot day, or the sting of cold water on a tired face. It woke you up. It made you feel alive. The critic with the glasses finally let go of the table. He sat back, his arms falling limp at his sides. He just watched. He forgot about his review. He forgot about the other contestants. There was no one else in the world right now but this girl. He saw the tear tracks shining on her cheeks in the bright stage lights, glinting like diamonds. He realized then that she wasn't performing. She was bleeding out her soul for them. Kyra threw her whole body into the final run of the cadenza. Her hands were a blur, moving so fast they looked like they were vibrating. She climbed up the scale, note by note, higher and higher, tighter and tighter, building the tension until the room felt like it was going to snap like a rubber band. The air was sucked out of the room. The audience leaned forward as one collective body. The judges forgot to breathe, and then, with one final, earth-shattering crash of both hands, the storm broke. She slammed her hands onto the keys, creating a wall of sound that seemed to suspend time itself. It was the loudest thing the hall had ever heard. It was the scream of the heart. It was the explosion they never saw coming. The grand piano, worth more than a house, shuddered under the impact. The sound rang out, echoing into the rafters, shaking the very foundations of the building. The explosion had happened, and nothing in the room would ever be the same. As the last thunderous chord faded into the rafters, Kyra did something strange. She didn't jump up to take a bow. She didn't flash a bright, fake smile at the judges. She didn't act like she had just conquered the world. Instead, she slumped forward. She pulled her shaking hands off the keys and pressed them against her chest, right over her heart. Her head dropped low, her chin nearly touching the gold buttons of the cheap black dress. Her shoulders heaved up and down. She was gasping for air, trying to catch her breath, like a swimmer who had just survived drowning. The silence that followed wasn't the bored, heavy silence from before. It was a holy, shocked silence, the kind that happens when something miraculous occurs and nobody knows how to react. The air in the Versailles Grand Hall felt different now. The dust motes dancing in the spotlights seemed to be suspended in time. The echo of the final note hung there, ringing in everyone's ears, refusing to disappear completely. The grandeur of the room, the gold leaf, the chandeliers, the expensive suits, it all seemed to dim in comparison to the raw human energy that had just exploded from the piano. For 5 long seconds, Nobody moved. It was as if the entire audience had turned to stone. The teenager in the back row was still holding his breath, his eyes wide and unblinking. The woman with the diamond ring had her hand covering her mouth, her eyes staring blankly at the stage. The man who had been checking his watch was now looking at his wrist as if it belonged to a stranger, completely unaware of the time. Then a sound broke the spell. It came from the center of the judges' table. The man with the silver hair, the one who had been ready to nap just minutes ago, slowly stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, but he didn't care. He smoothed the front of his jacket, but his hands were trembling slightly. He looked at Kyra, not as a critic judging a student, but as a human being witnessing greatness. He brought his hands together. Clap. It was a singular, sharp sound. It rang out clearly in the quiet room. Then the critic on the end stood up. He didn't bother to pick up his pen from the floor. He joined in the clapping, adding a rhythm to it. Clap, clap, clap. Suddenly, the dam broke. The audience erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping, the kind you hear at a polite tea party. It was a roar. It started as a wave of sound from the back and rolled forward like thunder. 500 people stood up as one. The sound was deafening. It filled the massive hall, bouncing off the walls, shaking the crystal glasses on the judges' table. People were whistling, stomping their feet, and shouting bravo. At the top of their lungs, Kyra heard the noise, but it felt like it was happening underwater. She was still in her own world. She was coming down from the high of the music. She felt drained, empty in a good way. She had poured everything out onto the keys, and now there was nothing left but a quiet peace. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing the wetness from her eyes. She realized she was crying. She hadn't even noticed. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up from the bench. Her legs felt like jelly. She turned to face the audience. The lights were so bright she couldn't see their faces clearly, but she could feel them. She could feel the wall of love and admiration coming at her. It was warm. It pushed against her, holding her up. She looked toward the judges. They were all standing now. Even the woman with the icy demeanor was on her feet, clapping with a genuine smile on her face. The man with the silver hair was not looking at his watch. He was looking right at Kyra, and he was nodding. It was a slow, deliberate nod. It was the highest honor he could give. He was telling her that she mattered. He was telling her that she belonged. Kyra's lips trembled. She tried to smile, but it came out as a crooked, vulnerable expression. She didn't feel like a famous pianist. She didn't feel like a rich star. She still felt like the girl in the second-hand dress. But for the first time in her life, she felt like that was enough. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the frayed red ribbon. She didn't wave it or show it off to the crowd. She just pressed it tight against her palm, feeling the rough texture. She looked up toward the ceiling, toward the heavens. Man whispered a silent thank you to the only person who would have truly understood the music she just played. The cheering got louder. A few people in the front rows were actually crying. They didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was the beauty of the music, or maybe it was because they had felt the truth in it. We all have grief. We all have things we can't say. And for 3 minutes, Kyra had said those things for them. She had turned their pain into something beautiful. She had taken the broken pieces of life and made a mosaic out of them. She gave a small, shy curtsy. It wasn't a perfect, practiced stage bow. It was clumsy and hurried, but it was full of grace. The audience roared even louder, screaming her name. Kyra, Kyra, Kyra. The sound washed over her, drowning out the fear, the doubt, and the memory of the bored silence from before. The fancy hall, the expensive piano, the competition, it didn't matter anymore. The barriers had come down. There were no judges and no contestants. There were just people, connected by a shared moment of truth. She walked to the edge of the stage to take one last bow. As she straightened up, she looked straight ahead and saw the exit doors. She knew that when she walked out those doors, she would go back to her normal life. She would go back to the small apartment. But something had changed inside her. The silence wasn't scary anymore. She had filled it. She had conquered it. She turned and walked back toward the piano, placing her hand gently on the sleek black lid. The monster was quiet now. It was just a machine again. But for a few minutes, it had been alive. She smiled, a real smile this time, a smile that reached her eyes. She turned one last time to the crowd, gave a small nod, and then walked off into the wings. Leaving the roaring sound behind her, stepping back into the shadows, her heart finally full.